The winds of time whisper through the ancient ruins, carrying tales older than the stars themselves, stories that have shaped the very fabric of our world. Imagine, for a moment, the vastness of the past, a time when gods walked among mortals and mythical creatures roamed the earth. These stories, passed down through the centuries, are more than mere legends. They are the heartbeat of ancient civilizations, echoing through every stone, every temple, every piece of art. As you close your eyes, let the weight of history sink into your bones. Feel the weightlessness of time itself as we embark on a journey into a realm where myth and reality are intertwined, where the gods' whispers still resonate with those willing to listen. This isn't just another recounting of ancient tales. It is an invitation to drift into a dreamscape of stories. These are the myths of the Greco-Roman world. Stories of gods and mortals, of impossible feats and tragic downfalls, of love and loss, of creation and destruction. As the words gently unfold, imagine being surrounded by the scent of incense, the distant sound of crashing waves, and the rustling of leaves in a breeze that has carried these stories from the shores of ancient Greece and the heart of Rome. Each myth weaves a spell that reaches deep into the core of our shared humanity, a journey that invites you to let go of the present and surrender to the magic of the past. But what if these stories are more than just tales meant to entertain? What if the myths are echoes of something deeper, a window into a world that once was, where gods and heroes existed in a delicate balance? These myths speak to us not only of the grandeur of gods and heroes, but the quiet moments when those very beings, despite their immortality and power, struggle with emotions so human: jealousy, love, fear, and rage. In these quiet spaces of vulnerability, we can find ourselves. The gods may be eternal, but they are also imperfect, and it is in their imperfections that the myths truly come alive. As you begin to listen, imagine yourself seated by a flickering fire in an ancient temple, the smoke curling into the night sky. The crackling of the flames is the only sound, save for the soft voice of the storyteller who beckons you into the myth. You can almost see the flickering shadows of ancient statues, gods and heroes frozen in time, watching over you as you settle deeper into the warmth of their stories. These are not merely legends to be memorized, but experiences to be felt deeply and with every sense. In the stillness of night, these tales are not bound by time. They live and breathe, just as they did in the hearts of those who first heard them. But even as the gods whisper their tales, it is important to remember that these stories did not begin in the same way that our modern tales do. These myths were not simply written down in books and passed around like bedtime stories. They were told in the flickering light of campfires, passed from one generation to the next, and they evolved over time, just as we, too, evolve. They were retold by the firelight, embellished and shaped by the voices of those who spoke them, transforming with every telling. Each storyteller added their own flair, their own perspective, and with it, the myth became a living thing, always in motion, always growing. What we hear today are the echoes of those ancient voices, filtered through centuries of change, but still carrying with them the essence of the original tale. These are the myths of gods and heroes, yes, but they are also stories of time itself, of the delicate balance between creation and destruction, love and loss. The rise of the Olympians, the great wars between the gods, the lives of mortals caught in their wake. All of it is a delicate dance of fate and free will, where nothing is ever quite as it seems. Each myth is a mirror, reflecting not just the gods but the human condition, with all its flaws and virtues. And as you listen, let the stories carry you through the labyrinths of your own mind, where you can ponder the great questions of existence. What is fate? What is the meaning of life? Are we the masters of our destiny, or are we merely players in a game set by forces greater than ourselves? In the quiet darkness, with the soothing cadence of the storyteller's voice, you'll begin to slip deeper into this world. The sound of the narrator's words will wrap around you like a soft blanket, drawing you away from the worries of the day and into a place where only the myths exist. The myths of the Greeks and Romans, ancient and eternal, will guide you through the gentle fog of sleep, where you will drift alongside gods and heroes, finding comfort in their timeless journeys. There is no rush here, no urgency to arrive at the end. For in a world of myth, the journey itself is a destination. And as you drift further into slumber, the stories will continue to play softly in the background of your dreams, their voices echoing to the corridors of time, gently guiding you into a peaceful, restful sleep. The stories themselves are as old as time, their origins lost in the sands of history, but their power remains undiminished. Each myth carries with it a message, a lesson that has withstood the test of time, transcending the boundaries of culture and language. And though these tales were first told in the streets of ancient cities, in the shadow of towering temples, they still have the power to speak to us today. They remind us that no matter how much time passes, we are all bound by the same emotions, the same fears, the same desires. These gods and mortals, with their complex relationships and struggles, are mirrors of our own lives, reminding us that we are not so different from those who live in a time so distant it seems almost like a dream. As the stories unfold, let the soothing rhythm of the narrator's voice guide you deeper into the world of ancient myths. There is no rush here, no need to remember every detail. Just allow yourself to relax and immerse in the rhythm of the narrative. The myths will carry you along like a gentle river, winding through the hills of history, through the vast landscapes of myth, and into the peaceful realms of sleep. In the world of these ancient stories, there is no need to hurry. Time stretches and bends like the tales themselves, slow and timeless, offering a space for reflection and rest. With each myth, you will find yourself becoming more and more immersed in the story, drifting deeper into the soothing cadence of the words. The gods, the heroes, and the mortals all will fade into the background, leaving only the stories themselves, timeless and eternal, a part of the fabric of the universe. These tales, which once filled the hearts and minds of ancient listeners, will now fill your dreams, where myths continue to live and breathe, gently guiding you into the world of sleep. In the beginning, before time as we know it existed, the universe was nothing more than a vast, empty void. It was chaos, a formless expanse where nothing could be defined, nothing could be seen or touched, and yet within this emptiness, there was potential, the potential for everything. From this primordial void emerged the first beings, not gods as we would come to know them, but entities that shaped the very essence of the cosmos. They were the first whispers of creation, a quiet stir in the nothingness. From chaos came Gaia, the earth, deep and ancient, vast and endless. Her form stretched through all corners of the world, connecting every living thing. And beside her, Uranus, the sky, endless and watchful, stretched above the earth in a cosmic embrace. Together, they formed the foundation of all that was to come, their union the very first pulse of life. Gaia, the embodiment of the earth, gave birth to mountains, the oceans, the forests, and plains. Her body became the landscape of the world, her breath carried by the winds that would soon sweep across the land. She gave birth to the Titans, beings of immense power, strength, and presence. These children of Gaia and Uranus were the first to rule the world, their power unmatched, their forms mighty and unstoppable. Among them were the great Kronos, a figure both terrifying and magnificent, whose power was unrivaled even among the gods. He stood at the helm of this new world, commanding the earth and sky with a force that could reshape reality itself. But even within this perfect order, there was discord, a quiet tension that rippled through the fabric of the universe. Uranus, who had created all things with Gaia, grew fearful of the power his own children possessed. He saw in them a threat, a challenge to his authority, and so he sought to imprison them, to hide them away in the depths of the earth, far from the light of the sun. But Gaia, ever protective of her children, could not bear to see them cast into the shadows, bound beneath the earth's surface. And so she devised a plan, a quiet rebellion that would change the course of history. Kronos, the youngest and most powerful of the Titans, took up Gaia's cause. He did what none of his siblings could do. He overthrew his own father. In a moment of violent betrayal, Kronos castrated Uranus, removing him from his place as the ruler of the universe. With Uranus gone, Kronos took his place, and for a time, he ruled with an iron fist. The world was his command, and he reshaped it in his image. Under his reign, the Titans ruled the cosmos, and their power seemed unassailable. Yet even in the highest moments of power, Kronos could not escape the shadow of his father's fear. For in the depths of his heart, Kronos knew that his children, like him, would one day challenge him as he had challenged Uranus. The seeds of betrayal were sown within Kronos' own heart. The prophecy, whispered to him by the very forces that had shaped his rise to power, foretold that one of his own children would rise against him. In a quiet, desperate act, Cronos sought to prevent this prophecy from coming true. He turned to a horrific solution. He swallowed his children one by one, as soon as they were born, hoping to prevent them from growing strong enough to overthrow him. Yet, even as he consumed each child, a part of him knew that his actions were a cruel parody of the very act of creation. He was swallowing the future, but in doing so, he was sealing his own doom. Rhea, the wife of Cronos and the mother of his children, could not bear to see her babies consumed by her husband. She cried silently as she watched him swallow each child, and in her grief, she found a quiet but fierce resolve. When the time came for birth of her youngest son, Zeus, she made a choice that would change everything. She hid him away, giving Cronos a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes, which he swallowed, believing it to be another of his children. Zeus, raised in secret by Gaia and the nymphs, grew strong and wise, his mind sharp as the blade of a sword. In the shadows of the earth, Zeus prepared for the day when he would confront Cronos, the father who had stolen his siblings' lives and his birthright. Zeus' journey to free his siblings from Cronos' stomach was long and perilous. He journeyed to the underworld and sought the wisdom of the great Titans, who had once ruled with his father. There, in the silent depth of the earth, he found the guidance he needed. With the help of the wise and powerful Titaness Métis, Zeus concocted a plan to free his siblings and to take his place as the ruler of the cosmos. He approached his father with quiet cunning, offering him a potion that would make him vomit up the children he had swallowed. And so, with a shuddering gasp, Cronos regurgitated the stone and his children, one by one. Hestia, Hera, Demeter, Poseidon, and Hades, fully grown and powerful. The siblings, now freed, stood together in silence, a bond forged in the deepest shadows. And thus, the war between the Titans and the Olympians began, a struggle not just for the throne of the gods, but for the very future of the universe itself. Zeus and his siblings rose up against Cronos and the Titans, each one bringing their unique powers to fight. In the silent, echoing chasm of the cosmos, the Titans and Olympians clashed in a battle that shook the very foundations of the earth and sky. The ground trembled beneath their feet. The stars seemed to flicker and fade as the gods battled with an intensity that could not be contained. The Titanomachy, the war between the old gods and the new, raged on for years, each side fighting not only for victory, but for the right to shape the world according to their will. Yet, even as the battle unfolded in a cacophony of violence, there was a strange, almost peaceful stillness that surrounded it. Time seemed to slow in those moments of conflict, the universe holding its breath as the gods collided with one another. The silence of the heavens became the backdrop for a war that was as much about destiny as it was about power. The Olympians, led by Zeus, were victorious in the end, and the Titans were cast down, imprisoned in the deepest pits of the earth, where they would remain for eternity. The Olympians, now in control of the cosmos, took their places as the rulers of the universe. Zeus, the mighty sky god, became their leader and his siblings. Poseidon, god of the seas, and Hades, god of the underworld, took their places in the realms they had come to rule. The earth, however, was shared among them all, and each god took dominion over a specific part of the world. The heavens themselves seemed to breathe again, their quiet whispers now the voices of the gods, whose reign would endure for countless ages. But even in their newfound power, the Olympians knew that the struggle for supremacy was far from over. Each god would face his own trials, his own challenges, as they sought to assert their dominance and define their place in the cosmos. And in the silent, ever-moving tides of time, their stories would continue to unfold, weaving a tapestry of myth that would echo through eternity. As you listen to this tale of ancient gods and their timeless struggles, allow the rhythm of the story to carry you deeper into the world of myth. Feel the weight of the gods' decisions, their rise to power and the price they paid for it, the tension of their battles, the quiet moments of reflection, and the ever-present pulse of time itself all come together in this moment of mythic history. It is a story that, despite its ancient origins, still resonates today, reminding us of the eternal dance between power and sacrifice, creation and destruction, and the unyielding passage of time. And as you drift further into the embrace of sleep, let the soft whispers of the gods guide you into a dream where time no longer matters, with eternal struggle continues in the quiet spaces between your thoughts. In the heart of Mount Olympus, where the skies seemed to meet the earth, the gods held their court. It was a place of grandeur and stillness, a realm where time itself appeared to pause, if only for a moment, in reverence to the divine beings who resided there. Yet, even in this serene abode, there was tension, for the gods were not perfect. They were powerful beyond measure, yet their hearts and minds often swayed by the same passions that could stir the souls of mortals. They had their virtues, but they were also marked by flaws that would define their actions and shape the fate of many, both divine and mortal. This was the true nature of the Olympians, magnificent, immortal, and yet unmistakably human. Zeus, the king of the gods, stood at the helm of this divine pantheon. With his thunderbolt in hand, his eyes cast toward the horizon, he was the embodiment of strength and authority. Yet beneath his imposing exterior lay a soul deeply entangled in the complexities of power. As the ruler of the heavens, he held dominion over all, but often found himself swayed by his emotions, particularly his desires. Zeus' romantic escapades were legendary, and his affairs were both numerous and often tumultuous. These affairs would have profound consequences, not only for Zeus himself, but for those around him. While he ruled the heavens with unmatched authority, his heart was far from steady, often shifting between love, lust, and jealousy. His relationships were a constant reminder of the delicate balance he had to maintain between his divine role and his human desires. And then there was Hera, his queen, whose beauty and power were second to none. She stood beside Zeus, regal and commanding, but her marriage was a battleground in itself. Her love for Zeus, though deep, was often marred by the sting of betrayal. She bore the weight of his infidelities, and each betrayal carved a wound into her heart that never fully healed. Hera's jealousy was fierce, a force that could rival the tempest itself. She watched as her husband's love for mortals often overshadowed her own, and in her jealousy, she would seek revenge on the women and children Zeus had wronged her with. But even in her wrath, there was a sadness, a quiet recognition that the power she held as queen of the gods was both a gift and a curse. It was a constant struggle for Hera to balance her loyalty to Zeus with her own dignity, and her wrath, though terrifying, was often born from a place of deep hurt. Poseidon, the mighty god of the seas, was another figure of immense power. His domain stretched far and wide, from the raging oceans to the calmest shores. With his trident, Poseidon could stir the seas into a frenzy or calm them with a mere flick of his hand. But beneath his strength lay a volatile temperament, a reflection of the vast, unpredictable nature of the oceans he ruled. Poseidon was known for his temper, which could be as wild and uncontrollable as the storms he commanded. Yet he was also a god capable of deep affection, especially for his children, and it was this love that often guided him through his darker moments. Despite his prowess and his ability to shape the seas, Poseidon, too, was caught in the web of desires and jealousies that so often define the Olympian gods. His relationships were complicated, filled with both passion and conflict, and his role as a god of both creation and destruction mirrored the duality within his own nature. Then there was Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, who held a unique place among the Olympians. She was revered not only for her strategic mind, but for her purity and commitment to justice. Unlike her fellow gods, Athena was often seen as a figure of rationality and restraint, her mind a sharp blade that could cut through the fog of chaos. But even Athena was not immune to the turmoil of the gods. Her role in the Trojan War, where she fought for both the Greeks and against the Trojans, revealed the deep inner conflict she carried. She sought victory with a clear mind, but the cost of that victory often weighed heavily on her conscience. Athena's relationship with her father, Zeus, was complex. She was both his daughter and his equal, a goddess whose wisdom often surpassed his own. In a way, Athena stood apart from the rest of the gods, with her quiet strength and ability to see the bigger picture. Yet she, too, was burdened by the same imperfections that plague her divine family. Ares, the god of war, was a figure of chaos and bloodshed, a force of nature that could not be tamed. He thrived in conflict, his heart beating faster with each battle he waged. Unlike Athena, who fought with reason and strategy, Ares fought with raw passion and a love for the carnage that came with war. His relationships were as violent as the wars he waged, filled with fervor but devoid of peace. Ares had a complicated connection to his fellow gods, especially his father, Zeus, who often viewed him as reckless and dangerous. Yet, despite his father's disapproval, Ares continued to fight, a constant reminder of the gods' complex relationship with violence. In Ares' heart, there was no love without war, no peace without struggle. His role as the embodiment of conflict was as much a curse as it was a gift, for he was forever trapped in the cycle of bloodshed and destruction. Then there was Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, whose presence could stir even the coldest of hearts. She was the most beautiful of the gods, a figure whose very existence was a reflection of the most powerful force in the universe, love. Yet, for all her beauty, Aphrodite was not immune to the turbulence that plagued the gods. Her love affairs were legendary, and her heart, though boundless in its capacity to love, was often torn by jealousy and betrayal. Aphrodite's beauty was both a blessing and a curse, for it attracted both admiration and envy. She sought love, but it was a love that often came at a cost, and her relationships, particularly with Ares, were marked by both passion and betrayal. Aphrodite's love was a force that could create life and destroy it, a force so powerful that it could bend the wills of gods and mortals alike. Each of the Olympians, in their own way, embodied the complexities of human nature. Their power was unmatched, yet their flaws were just as profound. They were gods, yes, but they were also deeply emotional beings, driven by the same desires and fears that shaped the lives of mortals. As they interacted with each other, as they clashed and reconciled, their stories became a mirror for us all, a reflection of the struggles we face in our own lives. The Olympians, with their strength and vulnerabilities, their passions and resentments, were as much a part of the human experience as they were a part of the divine. In the courts of Olympus, amidst the celestial beauty and the golden halls, the gods were more than just divine rulers. They were family bound by blood and fate, driven by emotions that often led them into conflict with one another. Yet, it was these very conflicts that gave life to the myths we cherish today, stories that continue to resonate across millennia. Their imperfections, their desires, their struggles, all speak to us in a way that transcends time. The gods may have been immortal, but their stories were deeply human, and it is in that humanity that they remain relevant to this day. Prometheus stood at the edge of the world, his heart heavy with both defiance and hope. The ancient gods had shaped the universe, crafting it with precision and purpose. They had given form to the earth, the heavens, the oceans, and the creatures that roamed the land. Yet, in their divine wisdom, they had neglected one thing, the gift of fire. It was a fire that would give humanity the warmth to survive, the light to see, and the strength to rise above their primitive existence. Without it, mankind would remain in the cold, dark void, unable to advance, unable to flourish. Prometheus, the Titan who had once been part of the ruling order, saw this and knew that something had to be done. He was not a god of great power like Zeus or Poseidon, nor was he a god of wisdom like Athena. He was a Titan, a being of great strength and intelligence, and it was his mind that had seen beyond the limitations of the world. In his heart, there was a fierce compassion for humanity. He had watched the mortals struggle, shivering in the dark, cold earth, unable to reach their potential. He had seen them suffer under the unyielding gaze of the gods, who had given them life but denied them the means to thrive. It was this compassion that drove Prometheus to make the boldest of decisions, to defy the gods themselves. But to steal fire from the gods, to take something so sacred and powerful, was not a simple act. It was a crime, one that would bring wrath upon him from the highest of the divine. He knew the risks, yet his resolve was unshakable. It was not just for the sake of humanity that he acted, but for the very essence of life itself. Fire was not just a tool. It was a symbol of the spark of intelligence, of the light of hope, of the warmth that could nurture growth. Without it, mankind would remain bound to the earth, enslaved to the cold, unfeeling forces of nature. Prometheus believed that the gift of fire was not the gods to withhold. It was something that belonged to all living beings, something that should be shared. And so, with quiet determination, Prometheus ventured into the heart of Olympus, where the gods held their court. There, hidden among the treasures of the gods, he found the divine flame. It was kept in a golden vessel, guarded by the mighty Hephaestus, god of fire and the forge. Prometheus, with his knowledge of the gods and their ways, knew how to take it. He carefully approached the flame, and with a swift movement, he stole a portion of it, wrapping it in a sacred fennel stalk. He carried the fire back to the earth, to the humans who so desperately needed it. The moment Prometheus delivered fire to mankind, a transformation began. The warmth that spread through the cold night was not just physical, it was symbolic. Fire represented life, a force that could create as much as it could destroy. It was a gift that allowed humanity to craft tools, to cook food, to light their homes, and to build civilizations. It was a gift that elevated them from mere animals to beings capable of reason, creation, and ambition. But with the gift came great responsibility. The fire was not just a source of warmth. It was a force of nature, one that could turn against those who were unwise in its use. Yet, despite its dangers, humanity thrived. They learned to harness the fire, to shape it, and to use it to carve their place in the world. The gods, however, did not view Prometheus' gift with the same admiration. Zeus, in particular, was enraged by the Titan's defiance. To give fire to humanity was to upset the natural order, to challenge the supremacy of the gods. It was an act of rebellion that could not go unpunished. Zeus, with his thunderbolt in hand, summoned Prometheus to Mount Olympus. There, before the entire pantheon of gods, Prometheus stood in silence, awaiting his fate. He knew the punishment would be severe, but even in the face of the gods' wrath, he did not regret his actions. Zeus, in his fury, condemned Prometheus to an eternal punishment. He would be bound to a rock, far from the warmth and light of the world he had tried to help. Each day, an eagle sent by Zeus would come and tear at his flesh, eating his liver, which would regenerate each night. It was an agonizing cycle, one that would continue forever, a symbol of the cause to define the gods. And yet, despite the pain, Prometheus did not cry out. He bore his punishment with silent resolve, for he knew that the fire he had given to humanity was a gift that would never be taken away. It had already begun to change the world, to ignite the spark of civilization, and no matter what the gods did to him, that change could not be undone. The suffering of Prometheus was not only a punishment, but a lesson. It was a reminder that there was a price to pay for defying the gods, for challenging the natural order. But it was also a reminder of the power of self-sacrifice, of the willingness to endure suffering for the sake of a greater good. Prometheus' pain was not without meaning. It was a sacrifice that would benefit humanity for generations to come. The fire he had stolen was more than just a physical flame. It was a symbol of hope, of defiance, and of the strength of the human spirit. It was a gift that would continue to burn brightly, even in the darkest of times. And so, the story of Prometheus became a part of the eternal tapestry of Greek mythology, woven into the very fabric of the god stories. It was a tale of defiance, of love for humanity, and of the price one must pay for standing against the gods. Prometheus was not a god, nor was he immortal, but something in between, a figure who bridged the gap between the divine and the human. His story was a reminder that the gods, for all their power, were not infallible. They were beings of emotion, of pride, and of vengeance. And in their pride, they had underestimated the resilience of the human spirit. Though Prometheus' punishment was eternal, his story was one of quiet triumph. The fire he had given to mankind continued to burn, fueling the growth of civilizations, sparking revolutions, and driving pursuit of knowledge. The gift of fire was not just a physical gift, but a metaphor for the creative power of humanity, a power that could not be extinguished by the gods, no matter how fiercely they tried. And in the end, Prometheus' gift proved to be a legacy far greater than any punishment could take away. His sacrifice was not in vain. The fire he had given to humanity continued to burn brightly, lighting the way for generations to come. Even as Prometheus suffered, even as the gods looked down upon him with disdain, the world he had helped create continued to evolve. Humanity would continue to rise, to grow, and to reach for the stars, forever carrying the flame that Prometheus had kindled. His punishment, though painful, was the price he paid for the gift that had forever changed the course of history. In his suffering, Prometheus had given humanity the one thing they needed to rise above the darkness, the fire that would light the way to a brighter future, and that fire would never die. In the beginning, there was only the void, a place of silence and formlessness. From this emptiness, The gods began their work, shaping the world as we know it. Yet, amidst all the grand designs, there was one creation that would stand apart from the rest, the creation of humankind. It was not an accident, nor a mere whim of the gods. It was a deliberate act, the shaping of beings who would walk the earth, feel the warmth of the sun, the coolness of the breeze, and the stirrings of emotions that only beings capable of deep thought could understand. The gods shaped humanity from the very earth itself, molding their forms from clay, breathing life into them with a divine touch. And in this act of creation, they breathed into humans not just life, but the capacity for greatness and tragedy alike. The gods, in their infinite wisdom, knew that to create life was not enough. They wanted to create something more, something that could reflect their own magnificence and fallibility. They desired beings who would share in the beauty of the world they had crafted, but who would also bear the weight of suffering and mortality. This duality was what made humans unique. They were neither divine nor wholly mortal, but something in between. They were gifted with intellect, curiosity, and capacity for love, but they were also bound by time, by the limitations of their bodies and minds. The gods saw this as both a blessing and a curse, for it was a very imperfection of humanity that would make them both fragile and resilient, doomed to suffer but also capable of rising above their circumstances. The creation of humankind was not a simple, one-time event. It was an ongoing process, one that would unfold over time, with each new generation of mortals adding its own layers to the story of a human race. The first humans, born of the gods' hands, were simple beings. They did not know the struggles of life, nor did they understand the complexities of their existence. They lived in a state of harmony with the world, unaware of the tensions and conflicts that would shape their future. But this simplicity could not last. As the humans grew in number, so did their desires. They began to question their place in the world, their purpose. It was this curiosity, this thirst for understanding, that set them apart from the other creatures that roamed the earth. Yet, despite their potential, the gods saw humans as flawed. They had given them intellect, yes, but they had also given them a capacity for greed, envy, and pride. These imperfections would lead to conflict, not just among the humans themselves, but also between the humans and the gods. The gods had created humankind with the best of intentions, but they knew that their creations would soon begin to make mistakes, to fall short of their potential. And so, with each new generation, the gods would watch closely, intervening when necessary, and guiding them toward a destiny that was both magnificent and tragic. One of the first acts of the gods in shaping humanity was to give them the gift of fire. Fire, a force of nature both destructive and creative, was a symbol of the human spirit. It represented the spark of life, the ability to transform the world, to craft and to destroy. The gods gave this gift with great caution, knowing that it could be used for good or evil, depending on the hearts of those who wielded it. They hoped that humanity would use fire wisely, to build, to warm, and to cook. But they also knew that it could be a dangerous tool, capable of destruction if left unchecked. The gift of fire was a double-edged sword, and the gods watched as the mortals learned to control it, realizing that this gift, like so many others, carried with it both a blessing and a curse. As humans began to harness fire, they discovered their own potential. They began to shape the world around them, building shelters, crafting tools, and forming societies. The simple humans of the past began to evolve, their minds expanding with every new discovery, every new thought. They sought to understand the world, to master it. They created civilizations, each one different from the last, each one filled with its own dreams and failures. The gods looked on with a mixture of pride and concern, watching as their creations began to form their own identities, to build their own futures. But as humanity grew, so too did its flaws. The very intellect that had made humans unique began to breed conflict, as individuals and groups vied for power, wealth, and control. And so, the gods began to intervene, each in their own way, guiding humanity down a path that was as much about struggle as it was about progress. It was not just the gods who shaped humanity. Humanity also shaped itself. As the humans learned more about their world, they also began to understand themselves. They began to ask questions about their origins, about their place in the universe, about their purpose. These questions, simple yet profound, became the foundation of philosophy, of the search for meaning. The humans, in their quest for knowledge, began to turn inward, exploring the depths of their own souls. They sought wisdom not just from the gods, but from within themselves. And in this search, they began to understand the complexities of their existence, the tension between their divine potential and their mortal limitations. It was this search for understanding that would lead to the great philosophers, the poets, and the thinkers who would shape the intellectual legacy of the world. Yet, as they delved deeper into the mysteries of existence, the humans also discovered the darker aspect of their nature. They realized that they were not just creatures of light, capable of great deeds, but also creatures of shadow, capable of cruelty, betrayal, and selfishness. The gods had given them free will, the ability to choose their path, and with this gift came the weight of responsibility. The mortals realized that they could shape their own destinies, but they could also destroy themselves if they were not careful. The same fire that had warmed their homes could burn them down. The same intellect that had brought them understanding could lead to pride and greed. And in this realization, they began to understand the duality of their existence, the delicate balance between creation and destruction, light and dark. The gods, too, understood this duality. They had created humankind to be something more than mere animals. Yet they had also given them the capacity for error, for failure. It was in this imperfection that the true story of humanity would unfold. For every great achievement, there would be a tragedy. For every victory, there would be a defeat. And in each of these moments, the gods would watch closely, knowing that humanity's greatest strength would come from their ability to rise after each fall, to learn from their mistakes and continue on. The gods had given humanity the gift of life, of intellect and of fire, but it was up to humanity to decide how they would use these gifts. And in that decision, they would create the world, a world that was both beautiful and tragic, filled with moments of brilliance and darkness, hope and despair. As the humans continued to grow and change, they began to realize that their destiny was not set in stone. They were not bound to repeat the mistakes of the past. They could carve their own future. The gods had given them the tools, but it was up to them to decide how to use them. The fire that had once been a symbol of humanity's potential was now a reminder of their responsibility. It was no longer just a gift from the gods. It was a force that belonged to humanity, one that they could control or let slip beyond their reach. And in this realization, the humans found both power and humility. They were capable of great things, but they were also aware of the fragility of their existence. They were creatures of the earth, shaped by the gods, but it was their own choices that would define their place in the world. As they continued to explore their world and their own souls, the humans realized that they were not alone in their quest for meaning. The gods, too, had their own struggles, their own imperfections. And in this shared understanding, the humans and the gods would forever be linked, their fates intertwined by the very fire that had sparked the beginning of it all. In the golden age of mankind, the world seemed a place of perfect harmony, untouched by the burdens of time and suffering. It was an era where men and women lived in a state of grace, free from the toil and strife that would later plague their descendants. They knew no hunger, no sickness, no death. The earth yielded its fruits without effort. The skies were always clear, and the seasons followed their natural rhythms without disturbance. There were no wars, no rivalries, no greed or malice to darken their hearts. This was the golden age, a time when humanity existed in its purest form, blessed by the gods and untouched by the chaos that would later define their existence. The gods themselves watched over this age with a gentle, approving gaze. It was a time before the rise of civilization, a time when humans were still close to their divine origins. They had not yet learned the ways of the world, nor had they succumbed to the complexities of life. They lived in peace, unburdened by the struggles that would come in the future. They were, in essence, the children of the gods, their hearts full of innocence and wonder. This was a time when humans lived in perfect balance with nature, when they understood the beauty of the earth and honored its gifts without question. They walked the land like the gods themselves, their every step in tune with the divine. But as with all things, the golden age could not last forever. The gods, in their wisdom, knew that perfection could not be maintained for eternity. Time, ever moving forward, would bring change, and with it, the inevitable challenges that would test the strength of mankind. It was during this time that the first seeds of discord were sown, though they were small at first, barely noticeable against the backdrop of this idyllic world. There were whispers among the gods, subtle stirrings of doubt and dissatisfaction. The Olympians, in their wisdom, had created this perfect world, but they knew that perfection could not remain without end. Change was inevitable, and with it, the struggles that would come with it. The downfall of the Golden Age began with the gods themselves, as they too were bound by the laws of time and destiny. Zeus, who ruled over the heavens, looked down upon the mortals with a mix of pride and concern. He saw that they had begun to grow restless, their once simple existence now clouded by the stirrings of ambition. The world was no longer enough for them. They began to crave more power, more knowledge, more wealth. They had tasted the sweetness of peace and prosperity, and now they longed for something greater. The very innocence that had made them pure now became their downfall. The gods, too, began to notice the first signs of greed and envy among the humans. They had created a world where everything was provided for them, but now the humans began to take these gifts for granted. They no longer respected the earth as they once had, no longer saw it as a divine blessing, but as something to be exploited and consumed. Their hearts, once pure, began to harden, and with this change, the harmony of the Golden Age began to slip away. The gods could not ignore this transformation. They knew that the balance of the world was shifting, and they feared that the purity of mankind was being lost forever. It was a delicate balance, one that could not be easily restored once broken. And so, they began to withdraw from the mortal world, leaving it to the whims of time. The mortals, no longer guided by the constant presence of the divine, began to struggle in ways they had never known before. What had once been an effortless existence was now fraught with difficulty. The earth no longer yielded its bounty without effort. The skies darkened, the seasons became unpredictable, and the balance of nature itself was disrupted. The innocence of the Golden Age faded, replaced by the harsh realities of life. The mortals, once living in perfect harmony with the world, now found themselves at odds with it. It was during this time that the first signs of conflict appeared among the mortals. Without the guidance of the gods, they began to compete for the earth's resources. The world, once abundant and bountiful, now seemed smaller, more fragile. The greed that had once been a distant concept now took root in the hearts of men. The first wars began to stir, though they were not yet battles of great armies or grand armies of men. Instead, they were skirmishes, small conflicts born of fear and the desire to secure what was once given freely. The peaceful simplicity of the Golden Age was no more. Humanity had crossed the threshold into the age of struggle and hardship. The gods, witnessing the collapse of the Golden Age, saw the inevitable consequences of their creation. The mortals had been given everything: peace, prosperity, and the earth's bounty, but in return they had failed to appreciate the divine gifts. The gods could not restore what had been lost, for the balance had been irrevocably altered. They had given humanity the world, but now it was up to the mortals to decide how to use it. The gods could no longer protect them from the consequences of their actions. The Golden Age, for all its beauty and grace, had come to an end. What followed was an era of struggle, where humanity would be forced to face the challenges of survival, of ambition, and of fate. The gods, having witnessed this decline, withdrew even further, leaving humanity to fend for itself in the wake of the paradise that had once been. But even in this time of loss, there remained a glimmer of hope. The memories of the Golden Age, though fading, would never truly disappear. They would live on in the hearts of the mortals, in the legends passed down through the generations. The mortals, though now burdened with the weight of time and change, would never forget the beauty of the world they had once known. And in their struggles, they would find strength, as they had in the past. The gods had created them with the potential for greatness, and even in the face of hardship, that potential would never be fully extinguished. The Golden Age may have ended, but it had left its mark upon the earth. It was a time of innocence and peace, a time that humanity could never truly forget. The lessons learned in that age, though painful, would shape the future of mankind, guiding them to the struggles and challenges that would follow. As the gods withdrew and the world shifted into a new era, the mortals were left to carve their own path. They would no longer live in the idyllic peace of the Golden Age, but they would carry its memory with them, always striving to return to the harmony that had once existed. The world had changed, but the potential for greatness remained. And in that potential, the mortals would find the strength to rebuild, to rise from the ashes of the past, and to create a new age, one shaped by the lessons learned in the fading light of the Golden Age. In the vast expanse of the ancient world, a great war began to unfold, a war that would shake the foundations of the heavens themselves. It was a time when the gods, once unified in their creation of the world, found themselves divided, torn apart by jealousy, power struggles, and ancient grievances. The very balance of the universe teetered on the edge of collapse as the mighty Titans, once rulers of the cosmos, found themselves in a fierce conflict with their offspring, the Olympians. The clash between these two mighty forces would come to be known as the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans. It was a battle for control of the universe, a battle that would determine the fate of all existence, and it would be fought not just on the physical plane, but in the hearts and minds of the gods themselves. The Titans were powerful beings, the children of Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky. They were the first gods, beings of immense strength and ancient wisdom who had ruled the universe for eons. They had shaped the world and its creatures, but as time passed, their power began to wane. The gods of Olympus, their children, grew restless, eager to overthrow the Titans and claim their birthright. Among the Olympians, it was Zeus who rose to lead the charge. He was the son of Cronos, the king of the Titans, and he had seen the tyranny of his father firsthand. Cronos, in his paranoia, had swallowed each of his children as soon as they were born, fearing that one of them would overthrow him as he had done to his own father. But Zeus, hidden away by his mother Rhea, had escaped this fate. Raised in secret, he grew strong and wise, and when the time came, he swore to free his siblings and take his rightful place as the ruler of the gods. Zeus' rebellion against Cronos marked the beginning of a new age, an age where the Olympians would challenge the Titans for supremacy. The battle for control of the cosmos was not just a war of physical might, but a struggle for the very future of the universe itself. The Olympians, led by Zeus, sought to overthrow the Titans and establish a new order, one that would be ruled by their own line. But the Titans, unwilling to relinquish their power, were determined to fight to the death to preserve their reign. The conflict that ensued was fierce and unrelenting, a war that raged across the heavens, shaking the very foundations of the world. At the heart of the Titanomachy was the clash between father and son. Zeus, determined to avenge the wrongs of his father, sought to overthrow Cronos and free his siblings from their prison inside the Titan's belly. The war was a personal one for Zeus, for it was his own family that stood against him. But it was not just a fight for vengeance, it was a fight for freedom. The Olympians, united in their desire for a new world order, fought with all their might to overthrow the tyranny of the Titans. They called upon their allies, the Cyclopes and the Hundred-Handed Ones, who had been imprisoned by Cronos and his fellow Titans. These ancient beings, imprisoned in the depth of the earth, had the power to turn the tide of the battle. The Cyclopes, with their mighty forges, crafted Zeus' thunderbolts, weapons of immense power that would become his signature. The Hundred-Handed Ones, with their countless arms, threw boulders with the force of mountains, striking fear into the hearts of the Titans. Together, these powerful beings joined the Olympians in their struggle, and the battle for the cosmos began. The war raged on for 10 long years, each side fighting with unrelenting fury. The Titans, with their immense strength and ancient knowledge, were formidable opponents, but the Olympians, driven by the promise of a new era, fought with fire that could not be extinguished. Zeus, with his thunderbolts, struck down the Titans one by one, while his brother Poseidon, god of the seas, summoned mighty waves and storms to weaken their foes. Hades, the god of the underworld, played a crucial role in the conflict, using his powers over death to trap the Titans in the darkest corners of the earth. The Olympians, though younger and less experienced, were united by their cause, and their determination drove them forward, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The battle reached its climax when Zeus, in a final act of defiance, confronted his father, Cronos, in a showdown that would determine the fate of the gods and the universe. The two gods clashed in a storm of power and fury, their battle shaking the heavens themselves. Cronos, the mighty Titan, was a formidable opponent, but Zeus, armed with his thunderbolts and fueled by his desire for justice, struck the final blow. With a mighty thunderstrike, Zeus defeated his father, casting him and the other Titans down into the deepest pits of Tartarus, the darkest and most desolate part of the underworld. The Titans were imprisoned, their power broken, and the Olympians emerged victorious. But even in victory, there was a quiet sadness, a recognition that the Titanomachy had come at a great cost. The gods had triumphed, but the war had shattered the peace that had once existed in the heavens. The world, forever changed by the conflict, would never be the same. The underworld, a place where the sun's light barely touched, where shadows stretched into eternity, held within it the most profound and unsettling mysteries of the ancient Greek world. It was ruled by Hades, the god of death, a figure often misunderstood and shrouded in an aura of both fear and respect. Hades was not the malevolent deity many believe him to be. Rather, he was a god bound to the inevitable laws of life and death, administering the final passage for all souls. His realm, the underworld, was not a place of punishment for wicked, but rather a realm where all souls, regardless of their deeds, would eventually find their rest. Yet among the many tales that swirl around this dark and enigmatic domain, none are more captivating, poignant, and tragic than the story of Persephone, the goddess who would become queen of the underworld. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest and fertility, was a figure of grace and beauty, admired by gods and mortals alike. Her life was filled with the light of spring, the bloom of flowers, and the warmth of the earth. She danced through meadows, gathering flowers, her laughter ringing out like a melody on the wind. To her mother, Demeter, Persephone was the light of her life, her only child, and the very symbol of the bounty and beauty that the earth could offer. The bond between them was unbreakable, a mother's love for her daughter, pure and unyielding. Persephone's life seemed set to follow the path of the seasons, eternally part of the earth's renewal. However, the gods, in their eternal wisdom and, at times, their capriciousness, had other plans for her. One day, as Persephone roamed the fields, gathering flowers, the earth beneath her feet began to tremble. From the ground emerged a chasm, a dark opening from which Hades, the god of the underworld, appeared. With his cold, shadowed eyes and his imposing presence, Hades was a figure of dread to all who inhabited the upper world. Without warning, and in a move that would change the course of history, he seized Persephone and dragged her down into the dark depths of his realm. She was taken so swiftly, so violently, that there was no time for her to cry out, no time for her mother to intervene. The earth closed over her, leaving Demeter in a state of devastation and despair. The moment Persephone was taken to the underworld, the world above began to die. Demeter, stricken with grief, withdrew from the world, refusing to let the earth bear fruit or bloom until her daughter was returned to her. The fields withered, the crops died, and the world grew cold and barren. Nature itself seemed to mourn with Demeter, and the gods, seeing the destruction that was unfolding, sought to intervene. Zeus, the king of the gods, understood the gravity of the situation. The earth could not survive in this state of imbalance, and so he sent Hermes, the messenger god, to the underworld to bring Persephone back to her mother. However, the journey to retrieve Persephone was not as simple as it seemed. Hades, in his quiet but firm manner, had no intention of releasing the goddess of spring. Persephone had already eaten the food of the underworld, a pomegranate seed, a simple yet significant act. According to the ancient laws, anyone who consumed food in the realm of the dead was bound to the underworld forever. This small act, which seemed inconsequential to Persephone at the time, would become the key to her fate. Persephone's time in the underworld had changed her. She had not been a passive prisoner, but had begun to understand her new role, her new identity. While Hades ruled the dead with a quiet authority, Persephone grew to become his queen. Her beauty and grace brought a sense of life to the shadowed realm, and as time passed, she began to adapt to her surroundings. She ruled alongside Hades, guiding the souls of the departed, helping to bring order to the chaotic, eternal realm of the dead. Persephone's bond with Hades grew, though it was not without its complexities. In the dark corners of the underworld, she began to understand the depth of the god's nature. Hades, often misunderstood by those above, was not a tyrant, but a ruler bound by his responsibilities. Though he had taken Persephone against her will, he did not mistreat her. Instead, he sought to make her his equal, the queen of his realm. Despite this newfound role and her growing acceptance of the underworld, Persephone's heart still ached for the world above, for the light and warmth of the earth. Her mother's grief weighed heavily on her, and the separation was a wound that could not fully heal. As time passed, Persephone found herself torn between two worlds, the dark, eternal world of the dead, where she had come to rule, and the bright, living world above, where her mother and the earth seasons awaited her. Zeus, seeing the conflict within Persephone, knew that a solution must be found that would bring balance to both the realms. It was then that a compromise was struck, a decision that would shape the fate of the earth for all time. Persephone would spend a portion of the year in the underworld, where she would rule beside Hades, and the rest of the year she would return to her mother, Demeter. This arrangement, born from the gods' wisdom and the necessity of balance, became the foundation of the seasons. When Persephone returned to the earth, Demeter's joy and love for her daughter would bring spring and summer, and the world would bloom once again. But when Persephone descended back into the underworld, the earth would fall into winter, the cold and darkness mirroring the grief of her mother's temporary loss. This cycle of life and death, of presence and absence, became a symbol of the eternal rhythm of nature. The earth, much like Persephone herself, was bound between two worlds, the world of the living and the world of the dead, the world of light and the world of shadow. Persephone's story was not just one of abduction and loss, but also of transformation and growth. It was a tale of how the boundaries between life and death, light and darkness, were not as fixed as they might seem. Persephone had moved from a life of innocence and beauty to one of power and responsibility. She had grown into a ruler, a queen, but she had also retained her connection to the world above, to her mother, to the earth that bore her. In this dual existence, Persephone found her identity, a goddess of both life and death, of growth and decay, a being who bridged the gap between two realms, two forces, and two worlds. And so, the myth of Persephone continued to live on, not just as a story of abduction and loss, but as a story of the inevitable cycle of life and death that governs all things. It was a reminder that both light and darkness are necessary for balance, that the earth's rebirth is inseparable from the quiet, inevitable passing of seasons. Persephone, the queen of the underworld, had become a symbol of the eternal cycle, a goddess who ruled both the living and the dead, her story eternally intertwined with the rhythms of the earth itself. Orpheus, the son of the muse Calliope and the god Apollo, was a figure whose very existence seemed woven from the threads of beauty and sorrow. His talents were unmatched, for he possessed the ability to play the lyre in such a way that it could move even the hardest of hearts. His music was more than just sound. It was an expression of the soul, a force that could calm storms, make rivers stop in their tracks, and persuade trees to move in time with his melodies. Orpheus' music was not simply heard. It was felt, resonating deeply within all who listened. Even the gods, who were used to the beauty of the world, were stunned by his songs, as they carried with them the purity and power of the universe itself. With every note, Orpheus connected the mortal world to the divine, bridging the gap between the earth and the heavens. His fame spread far and wide, and it was not long before Orpheus' music reached the ears of Eurydice, a beautiful nymph, whose heart would become irrevocably entwined with his. The two fell deeply in love, their bond one that seemed destined by the very forces of nature. Eurydice, who had lived a life of freedom and simplicity, found herself drawn to Orpheus not only for his music, but for the gentleness of his spirit. In him, she saw not only a man of great talent, but one of profound depth and sensitivity, someone whose soul mirrored her own. Their love, though simple, was pure and filled with the promise of a future built upon shared dreams and a quiet understanding of one another. However, as with all things in the world of gods and mortals, fate had its own designs. On the day of their marriage, as Eurydice danced joyously through the meadow, a tragic accident occurred. A snake, hidden in the grass, struck her, its venom taking her life instantly. The world that had once seemed so full of promise and music for Orpheus now seemed barren, hollow, and silent. His heart, torn by grief, could not accept the loss of his beloved Eurydice. His world of music, once so full of life and joy, now became a mournful cry for the love he had lost. Orpheus, in his overwhelming sorrow, could not bear to live in a world where Eurydice no longer existed. Determined to bring her back, he turned to the only place where the dead could be reached, the realm of the underworld. Armed with nothing but his lyre and his unwavering love, Orpheus descended into the dark and cold land of Hades, the god of the dead. The journey was not a simple one. It was fraught with dangers and unknown horrors, for the underworld was a place where only the souls of the departed could wander, and the living were not meant to tread. But Orpheus, in his desperation, did not hesitate. His love for Eurydice drove him onward, through the darkness, past the rivers of the dead, and into the very heart of the underworld itself. Upon reaching the throne of Hades and Persephone, Orpheus began to play his lyre, pouring all his sorrow, all his love, and all his yearning into music. The sound of his lyre, sweet and haunting, echoed through the shadowed halls of the underworld. The music was so beautiful that it moved even the hard-hearted rulers of the dead. Hades, who ruled over the realm of darkness, was said to be unmoved by many things. But Orpheus' song stirred something deep within him. Persephone, too, was touched by the raw emotion that poured from Orpheus' heart. The music seemed to speak to them, not just of love and loss, but of the pain that bound all living things together. It was a plea that transcended the boundaries of life and death, a cry from the deepest part of the human soul, and it was one that neither Hades nor Persephone could ignore. Moved by Orpheus' devotion, the gods of the underworld agreed to return Eurydice to him. But there was one condition. He could take her back to the world of the living, but only if he followed a strict rule. He must not look back at her until they had reached the surface. To do so, to look back before they had crossed the threshold of the underworld, would mean that Eurydice would be lost to him forever. The condition, though seemingly simple, was a cruel one, for Orpheus' heart was filled with doubt. Was Eurydice truly behind him, following him through the darkness? Would she be there when he reached the surface? Or had he lost her forever? The fear of losing her again gnawed at him, and with each step he took, the temptation to glance back grew stronger. But Orpheus, filled with longing and uncertainty, could not resist. As they neared the surface, he turned, his gaze seeking the reassurance of Eurydice's presence. In that moment their eyes met, and just as the gods had foretold, Eurydice vanished, swallowed once more by the shadows of the underworld. Orpheus cried out in despair, but it was too late. His gaze had broken the promise, and in that instant his beloved was lost in him forever. The music that had once filled the world with life now echoed only with grief and sorrow. Orpheus, heartbroken and unable to bear the weight of his loss, withdrew from the world of men. He no longer played his lyre for anyone but himself, his music now filled with the lament of love that could never be fulfilled. Orpheus' story became one of the most poignant and tragic in Greek mythology, a tale of love, loss, and the frailty of human existence. His journey to the underworld, his refusal to follow the gods' command, and the resulting loss of Eurydice spoke to the heart of the human condition. It was a tale that resonated with anyone who had ever loved deeply, who had ever experienced the pain of losing someone they held dear. Orpheus' music, once so full of beauty and joy, became a symbol of the fragility of life, of how even the most powerful emotions could be destroyed in an instant by doubt, fear, or a momentary lapse in faith. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice reminds us of the complexities of love and the dangers of longing for the past. Orpheus, in his desperate desire to reclaim what he had lost, failed to see that some things, once gone, cannot be brought back. His love for Eurydice, while pure and unwavering, was not enough to overcome the rules that govern life and death. In the end, Orpheus' fate was sealed not by his lack of devotion, but by the very nature of his humanity, his inability to relinquish control, to trust in the promises made to him. His tragic end serves as a reminder that love, in all its forms, is both a source of strength and vulnerability. And though his music could move the gods themselves, it could not save him from the forces that govern life, death, and the passage of time. Hercules was a figure larger than life, both in his physical stature and in the sheer magnitude of the feats he accomplished. He was born to the mortal Alcmene, but his father was none other than Zeus, the king of the gods. His very birth was a sign of the divine and mortal worlds colliding, and from the moment of his birth, his fate was entwined with the gods in ways that would mark him for both greatness and tragedy. As a child, Hercules was already marked by strength beyond any mortal's imagining, a power that was both a blessing and a curse. The gods, watching over him, saw in him not just the potential for greatness, but also the promise of great suffering. Heracles' journey would not be an easy one. It would be one of constant struggle, of trials that would push him to his limits and beyond, forcing him to confront not only the challenges of the world around him, but the deepest parts of his own soul. His first trials came early in his life. The queen of the gods, Hera, who was notorious for her jealousy, could not bear the existence of Hercules, the product of Zeus' infidelity. Fueled by her rage, she sought to destroy him. Even as an infant, she sent 2 venomous serpents to his cradle. But Heracles, even in his infancy, was a force to be reckoned with surprising strength. He seized the snakes and strangled them, his first victory against the forces that sought to tear him down. But this was just the beginning. The life of Heracles would be marked by the wrath of Hera, a relentless pursuit that would follow him throughout his existence, as the goddess sought to thwart him at every turn. As Heracles grew older, his strength only increased, and so did the challenges he faced. His fame spread far and wide, and with it came envy and the inevitability of conflict. He became known not only for his physical prowess, but for his courage and his willingness to take on any challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed. Yet, even with all his strength and valor, Heracles was not immune to the flaws of mortality. His heart was pure, but he was also subject to moments of rashness, of fury that would sometimes cloud his judgment. His very greatness, his immense power, was often the source of his greatest troubles. In his desire to prove himself, to live up to the expectations of both gods and mortals, Heracles often found himself at the center of conflicts that could not be easily resolved. His greatest challenge came when he was tricked by the goddess Hera into committing a terrible crime. In a moment of madness, brought on by Hera's jealousy and the madness she had cast upon him, Heracles killed his wife and children. When he came to his senses, filled with remorse and guilt, he was devastated by the consequences of his actions. This tragedy marked a turning point in his life, and in the aftermath, he sought redemption. It was through his repentance and desire to atone for the horrors he had unknowingly committed that Heracles would embark on the most famous of his labors, the 12 labors of Heracles, a series of impossible feats designed to cleanse him of his sins and earn him a place among the gods. The 12 labors were tasks of incredible difficulty, each one designed to test every aspect of Heracles' strength, intelligence, and character. The first task was to slay the Nemean lion, a creature whose hide was impervious to weapons. Armed only with his strength and determination, Heracles strangled the lion with his bare hands, taking its pelt as his prize. This was just the beginning of a journey that would take him across the known world, into dark forests, treacherous mountains, and the deepest corners of the earth. He would face monsters, deadly creatures, and impossible odds, but through each trial his strength, courage, and resolve grew stronger. His second labor was to capture the 9-headed Hydra, a beast whose heads would regenerate if severed. Each time Heracles cut off one of its heads, 2 more would appear in its place. Yet, with the help of his nephew Iolaus, who cauterized the stumps of the heads to prevent them from growing back, Heracles was able to defeat the Hydra, adding another impossible victory to his list. Yet, the task was not without its challenges. The Hydra's poisonous blood would later prove to be a potent weapon in Heracles' future endeavors, as he dipped his arrows in it, turning them into deadly projectiles. The next labor took him to the Augean stables, where he was tasked with cleaning the stables of King Augeas, which had not been cleaned in years. The challenge seemed impossible. The stables were home to thousands of cattle, and the filth was beyond comprehension. But Heracles, with his ingenuity, diverted the rivers Alpheus and Punnius to wash away the filth in a single day, completing the task with a cleverness that matched his physical strength. This labor was not just a test of physical ability, but of Heracles' resourcefulness and his ability to think beyond the immediate challenges. Heracles' journey through the 12 labors took him across vast landscapes, each labor more grueling than the last. He battled the Stymphalian birds, creatures with sharp metallic feathers that could kill from a distance. With the help of Athena's gift, a rattle that frightened the birds into flight, Heracles shot them down, adding another victory to his name. He captured the Ceryneian hind, a creature sacred to Artemis, a task that required both speed and patience, for the hind was elusive and swift. The golden hind was a creature of incredible beauty and speed, and Heracles had to chase it for a year before he finally captured it, making sure to avoid angering Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. The Cretan bull, a wild creature of incredible strength, was another of his labors. With brute force, Heracles was able to overpower the bull, bringing it back alive to King Eurystheus, completing yet another impossible task. He also captured the Mars of Diomedes, which were wild, carnivorous horses that had once belonged to the Thracian king Diomedes. Heracles tamed them by feeding them their master, completing the task with grim determination. The Trojan War, a conflict that would shape the course of history and mythology alike, began not with the clash of armies, but with a single moment, a single decision. The gods, ever present in the affairs of mortals, had a hand in setting the stage for this monumental struggle. It all began at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, a marriage that was meant to be a union of peace and celebration. However, the gods were not content with leaving this event unmarked by their usual meddling. At the gathering, Eris, the goddess of strife, was not invited, an oversight that would have grave consequences. Angered by her exclusion, Eris threw a golden apple into the midst of the festivities, an apple inscribed with the words for the fairest. The goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, each believing herself to be the most deserving, immediately began to quarrel over the prize. In the end, they turned to Paris, a mortal prince of Troy, to decide who should receive the apple. Paris, caught in the midst of this divine dispute, was promised rewards from each of the goddesses. Hera offered him power and dominion over Asia. Athena promised him wisdom and success in battle, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, promised him the love of the most beautiful mortal woman in the world, Helen. Paris, seduced by the promise of love, chose Aphrodite, thus sealing his fate and, in turn, the fate of Troy. The love of Helen, however, was not a simple affair. She was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta, and her abduction by Paris, though romantic in its mythology, sparked a series of events that would unravel the lives of countless mortals and gods. Menelaus, enraged by the theft of his wife, called upon his brother Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, and the other Greek kings who had once sworn an oath to protect Helen's marriage. The oath had been made when Helen was first courted, a promise made by her suitors that they would defend her marriage to the death. Now, with Helen's abduction, the suitors were bound by their word, and they set sail to Troy to bring her back. The Greeks, unified by this solemn oath, assembled an army of unparalleled strength, and thus began the war that would consume them for 10 years. The Trojans, led by the brave and honorable Hector, prepared for the inevitable siege. Troy, with its towering walls and impenetrable gates, seemed an almost unbeatable fortress. The city had been built by the gods themselves, and its walls were said to be so strong that no army could breach them. Paris, confident in the love he had won and protection of Aphrodite, did not fear the Greek invasion. Yet, the war that was to follow was not one of immediate victories and swift resolutions. It would become a war of attrition, a war fought with as much cunning and manipulation as with swords and spears. The Greeks, despite their unity, were not without their own divisions. Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief of the Greek forces, was a man of great ambition and authority, but his actions often came into conflict with the other Greek leaders. Early in the conflict, Agamemnon claimed Briseis, a war prize of Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors. In his pride, Agamemnon took the woman from Achilles, and in doing so, he insulted the mighty hero. Achilles, enraged and dishonored, withdrew from the battle, refusing to fight for the Greeks. This act of prideful defiance would have profound consequences, as Achilles was the key to Greek victory, and without him, the tides of war shifted dramatically. Hector, meanwhile, stood as Troy's greatest defender, a hero whose courage and devotion to his people were unmatched. He was a man of honor, a true warrior who fought for his family, his city, and his people. Unlike Paris, who was driven by selfish desires and the whims of the gods, Hector fought for a noble cause, the preservation of his home. Yet, despite his bravery, he could not stop the slow, grinding march of the war. The Trojans, too, were divided, and internal strife threatened to undo their efforts. Paris, despite his role in the war's inception, remained largely absent from the battlefield, preferring instead to linger in the shadows of his own selfish desires. It was Hector who bore the brunt of fighting, his valor and strength often the only thing standing between the Trojans and their enemies. As the years wore on, the Greek forces, despite their early successes, found themselves stalled outside the walls of Troy. The war was not going in their favor, and the Trojans, bolstered by their own pride and courage, resisted the siege with every ounce of their strength. It was a war of strategy and attrition, and the gods themselves began to take sides, intervening in the conflict as only they could. Apollo and Artemis supported the Trojans, while Hera, Athena, and Poseidon fought for the Greeks. The gods intervened directly, sometimes turning the tide of battle, sometimes working behind the scenes to manipulate the fates of mortals. It was during one of the many heated moments of the war that Achilles, his pride finally wounded by the death of his close friend Patroclus, rejoined the battle. His rage at the loss of his beloved friend turned him into an unstoppable force. Achilles slaughtered the Trojans with fury unlike anything seen before, his wrath becoming legendary. In one of the most iconic moments of the war, he faced Hector in single combat. Hector, knowing that his death was inevitable, fought with every bit of his strength and honor, but it was not enough. Achilles, driven by vengeance, killed Hector and dragged his body behind his chariot, refusing to allow the Trojans to mourn their fallen hero. This act of desecration was a powerful blow to the Trojans, for Hector was their last hope, their greatest warrior. His death left the city of Troy vulnerable and demoralized. However, even in the midst of his anger, Achilles was still bound by honor. He eventually allowed Hector's family to retrieve his body, and the funeral rites for Hector were one of the few moments of peace and respect in the otherwise brutal conflict. But the war was far from over. The journey of Odysseus was one not just of physical distance, but of emotional and spiritual depth. After the fall of Troy, he set sail for his home on the island of Ithaca, eager to return to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. Yet, the gods, whose whims had shaped the events of the Trojan War, had more plans for him. His journey would not be swift nor simple. It would take him through a labyrinth of trials, filled with gods, monsters, and supernatural forces that would challenge him not just as a hero, but as a man. Odysseus was no stranger to the gods' interventions. His cunning had once been instrumental in the Greeks' victory at Troy, as it was his idea to use the Trojan horse to deceive the Trojans into bringing the Greeks into their city. Yet, while he had earned the gods' favor for his cleverness, he had also made enemies among them. Poseidon, the god of the seas, was particularly enraged with Odysseus for blinding his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, and for the trickery that had been used to escape the creature's lair. Thus, Odysseus' journey home became a trial of endurance, a constant struggle against the god's wrath, as Poseidon sought to keep him from ever returning to Ithaca. The first of many obstacles Odysseus faced came when he and his men landed on the island of the Lotus Eaters. The island seemed peaceful, and the people there offered them the fruit of the lotus, a plant that was said to bring contentment and forgetfulness. But those who ate it lost all desire to return home. They forgot their families, their purpose, and the world they had come from. Odysseus, realizing the danger, managed to drag his men back to the ship, and they set sail once more, determined to reach Ithaca. The encounter with the Lotus Eaters was a moment that highlighted the theme of temptation that would run throughout his journey. The pull to abandon one's purpose for a fleeting sense of peace or contentment. Their next destination was the land of Cyclopes, where they encountered Polyphemus, a giant with a single, terrifying eye in the middle of his forehead. The Cyclopes were a primitive and uncivilized people, living in isolation and without regard for the gods. When Odysseus and his men stumbled upon Polyphemus' cave, they made the mistake of taking shelter there, unknowingly placing themselves at the mercy of the Cyclops. Polyphemus trapped them inside his cave and began devouring them one by one. But Odysseus, ever strategist, came up with a plan. He offered Polyphemus wine to make him drunk and then told him that his name was Nobody. When the Cyclops fell asleep, Odysseus and his men drove a sharp stake into his single eye, blinding him. When Polyphemus cried out for help, he told others that Nobody was attacking him, and so the other Cyclopes ignored his pleas. With the Cyclops defeated, Odysseus thought his troubles were over, but in his arrogance, he taunted Polyphemus as he and his men sailed away, revealing his true name. Polyphemus, enraged, called upon his father, Poseidon, to curse Odysseus, which set in motion the god's vendetta against him. As a result, Odysseus' journey became even more treacherous, marked by divine wrath and endless obstacles. The next significant stop on Odysseus' journey was the island of Aeolus, the god of the winds. Aeolus, moved by Odysseus' plight and impressed by his cleverness, gave him a gift, a bag containing all the winds, except for the west wind that would carry Odysseus home. He warned Odysseus not to open the bag, but the temptation was too great. Just as Ithaca was within sight, Odysseus' men, believing the bag contained treasure, opened it, releasing the winds and blowing their ship far off course. The momentary lapse in judgment, driven by greed and curiosity, cost them dearly, and they found themselves back at Aeolus Island, where the god refused to help them a second time. Their journey continued, and they came to the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of giant cannibals who destroyed all of Odysseus' ships except for the one he was aboard. The Laestrygonians killed many of his men, and it seemed as if disaster had struck once again. But Odysseus, ever resourceful, managed to escape with a small portion of his crew. The next trial was even more dangerous. They reached the island of Circe, a sorceress who turned Odysseus' men into swine. Once again, it was Odysseus' quick thinking that saved the day. With the help of the god Hermes, who gave him a magical herb called moly to protect him from Circe's spell, Odysseus confronted the sorceress and persuaded her to return his men to their original form. Afterward, Circe became an ally, providing them with guidance for their journey to the underworld. In the underworld, Odysseus sought the advice of the spirit of Tiresias, the blind prophet, who told him the path he must take to reach Ithaca. Tiresias warned him of the dangers yet to come, including the wrath of Poseidon and the temptation of the cattle of the sun god, Helios. He also foretold that Odysseus would return home alone after all of his men had perished. This prophecy weighed heavily on Odysseus, but he was determined to reach Ithaca and return to his family, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. As the journey progressed, the crew encountered the sirens, dangerous creatures whose enchanting song lured sailors to their doom. Forewarned by Circe, Odysseus had his men block their ears with beeswax and ordered them to tie him to the mast of the ship so that he could hear the siren's song without being tempted to steer the ship into the rocks. His resilience in the face of temptation was a testament to his determination and wisdom. Yet, this was only one of the many challenges that lay before him. After narrowly escaping the sirens, they passed through the strait between Scylla, a six-headed monster, and Charybdis, a deadly whirlpool. Odysseus, though warned of the dangers, had to choose between the two evils. In an agonizing decision, he sailed closer to Scylla, sacrificing 6 of his men to the monster rather than risk losing the entire ship to Charybdis. This act, though strategically sound, was one of the great moral dilemmas of his journey, showcasing the way of leadership and the difficult choices that leaders must sometimes make, even when there is no perfect solution. Finally, after a long and arduous journey, they reached the island of Thrinacia, home to the sacred cattle of Helios. Despite the warnings, Odysseus' men, driven by hunger and desperation, slaughtered the cattle. In retaliation, Helios demanded justice from the gods, and Zeus, in his wrath, sent a storm that destroyed the ship and killed all of Odysseus' men. Odysseus alone survived, cast ashore on the island of Ogygia, where the nymph Calypso took him in and kept him captive for several years. She offered him immortality, but his heart longed for home, and after much negotiation with the gods, he was finally allowed to leave. After nearly 20 years of wandering, Odysseus finally returned to Ithaca, but his trials were not over. His home had been overrun by suitors, men who had taken advantage of the prolonged absence of the king and were courting his wife, Penelope. His son, Telemachus, was now a young man, but the suitors had little respect for the royal family and were consuming the wealth of Ithaca. With the help of his son and a few loyal servants, Odysseus devised a plan to take back his kingdom. Disguised as a beggar, he infiltrated his own palace, testing the loyalty of his servants and his wife. In a final act of cunning and strength, Odysseus slew the suitors, reclaiming his throne and reuniting with Penelope and Telemachus. The story of Odysseus is not simply one of adventure and survival. It is a journey of transformation, of learning what it means to be human. His trials shaped him into a hero not just of strength, but of wisdom, patience, and perseverance. It was a journey that tested his resolve, his character, and his ability to make the most difficult choices. In the end, Odysseus returned home, but he had been irrevocably changed by the experiences he had endured. His story, one of struggle and triumph, is a testament to the power of resilience and the unyielding desire to return to one's roots, no matter the obstacles in the way. Aeneas, the Trojan hero, was no stranger to loss. His life, shaped by the fall of Troy and the weight of his people's demise, was marked by sacrifice, duty, and a journey that would ultimately lead to the founding of a new empire. Aeneas was a man defined not by personal ambition, but by a sense of divine purpose. His fate was intertwined with the gods themselves, each step of his journey influenced by prophecies, omens, and the will of the divine. Yet, despite the weight of destiny upon him, Aeneas remained a figure of courage, loyalty, and resilience. His story began in the ruins of Troy, the city his ancestors had fought so hard to protect, now reduced to ashes by the Greeks. The Trojan War, with its endless tragedy and betrayal, had left Aeneas as one of the few survivors, and it was his responsibility, given by the gods, to lead the remnants of his people to a new homeland. The fall of Troy was not merely the loss of a city, but the end of an era, and Aeneas' journey was a quest to reclaim the legacy of Troy and to establish a new beginning for his people. After the destruction of Troy, Aeneas, burdened with the death of so many and the devastation of his homeland, embarked on a journey that would take him across seas, through strange lands, and into the hearts of gods and mortals alike. The gods had commanded him to leave the burning ruins of Troy and to seek out a new land where he and his people could rebuild. The divine will was clear. Aeneas was chosen to be the founder of a new civilization, one that would eventually rise to dominate the Mediterranean world. But the journey would not be easy. The gods, despite their promises, did not always act in ways that made Aeneas' task easier. They tested him, they tormented him, and they placed obstacles in his path, some of which threatened not only his mission, but his very sense of self. One of the first challenges Aeneas faced was the loss of his wife, Creusa. As the Trojans fled from their burning city, Aeneas searched for her in the chaos, but she was lost in confusion. After a desperate search, Aeneas, overwhelmed by grief, received a vision of Creusa's spirit. She appeared to him and told him that it was not his fate to bring her along on his journey, that his duty was to the future of the Trojans, to the future of Rome. With her passing, Aeneas was forced to face the truth that his journey was not only about survival, but about the continuation of his people's legacy. His personal sorrow, while deep, would have to be set aside in pursuit of a greater purpose. Guided by the will of the gods, Aeneas set sail with his followers, seeking the promised land. Along the way, they encountered various lands and peoples, some of whom welcomed them, and others who sought to thwart their progress. One of the most significant encounters came when Aeneas and his men landed on the coast of Carthage, where Queen Dido ruled. Dido, a figure of great beauty and power, welcomed Aeneas and his crew, offering them refuge. The two became close, and soon a passionate love affair blossomed between them. However, this love, though deep and intense, was doomed from the start. Aeneas, bound by his destiny, could not stay in Carthage. His heart was torn between his love for Dido and his divine mission to establish the future of Rome. Despite Dido's pleas, Aeneas left her, setting sail once more for Italy. The gods had made it clear that his destiny lay elsewhere, and he was bound by that fate. Dido, heartbroken and betrayed, cursed Aeneas as he left, vowing that his descendants would suffer as she had. Her curse would linger over Aeneas' descendants, and her tragic end would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dido's death, caused by her own grief and despair, added another layer of sorrow to Aeneas' journey. It was not just the loss of a city or a homeland he mourned, but the personal toll of his destiny. Yet, despite the emotional turmoil, Aeneas pressed on, driven by the knowledge that his journey was not his own, that it was a journey toward the future, not just for Trojans, but for all of Rome's greatness. Eventually, Aeneas and his people reached the shores of Italy, the land that the gods had promised to him. However, his arrival was not met with immediate acceptance. The land was already inhabited, and the local king, Latinus, was initially hesitant to welcome the Trojans. Latinus' daughter, Lavinia, had been promised in marriage to Turnus, a powerful local leader, and her betrothal had already been arranged. The arrival of Aeneas, with his divine lineage and his claim to land, threatened to upset the delicate balance of power. Turnus, feeling slighted and threatened by Aeneas, declared war on the Trojans. What followed was a brutal conflict, a war between the Trojans and the local forces, led by Turnus. The conflict was not just a battle for land, but a war of identities, a war between the old world of the Latins and the new world that Aeneas sought to create. Aeneas, though a reluctant warrior, fought with a courage and determination that had become his hallmark. He was not a man of reckless ambition, but one of duty. The gods had chosen him, and his destiny was tied to the fate of his people and their future empire. Despite his inner turmoil, Aeneas led his men through the war, his victories on the battlefield becoming the stuff of legend. His strength, his leadership, and his unwavering resolve earned him the respect of his men and even of some of his enemies. Yet, the war was not without its sacrifices. Aeneas faced many challenges, both external and internal, as he struggled with the weight of his duty. He knew that every step he took toward the fulfillment of his mission came with a personal cost. The war between the Trojans and the Latins reached its climax in a final, fateful duel between Aeneas and Turnus. In this moment, Aeneas was faced with a choice that would define not only his future, but the future of Rome itself. Turnus, though a worthy opponent, was no longer fighting for the future of his people, but for his own pride and honor. Aeneas, in the heat of battle, struck down Turnus, securing victory for the Trojans. Yet, as he stood over the fallen Turnus, Aeneas was filled with a deep sense of sorrow. His victory, though necessary, was not a cause for celebration. He had killed a man who, like him, had fought for his people, and in that moment, the weight of his own destiny became almost unbearable. With the defeat of Turnus and the establishment of peace, Aeneas finally achieved his goal. He had founded a new home for the Trojans, a land where they would build a future, a city that would one day rise to become the heart of the Roman Empire. His journey, marked by sacrifice, loss, and divine intervention, had reached its end. Yet, Aeneas' story did not end with the founding of Rome. His legacy would live on through his descendants to the Roman Empire, which would rise to dominate the world, fulfilling the promise made by the gods. The tale of Aeneas is not just the story of a hero, but the story of the enduring struggle between personal desire and the greater good, between the past and the future. Aeneas' journey was one of transformation, not just for him, but for his people. It was a journey that bridged the destruction of Troy with the creation of something new, something greater. Through his trials and his triumphs, Aeneas embodied the values that would come to define Rome: duty, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of a destiny greater than oneself. His story would inspire generations to come, as the Romans looked to him as the founding father of their great empire. In the end, Aeneas' legacy was not just in the lands he conquered or the cities he founded, but in the values he passed down, a reminder that the true measure of a hero is not in what they achieve for themselves, but in what they leave behind for future generations. The story of Theseus is one that is deeply intertwined with the fate of Athens itself, for he was not only a hero of great strength, but also the very symbol of Athenian identity and unity. His tale begins with a birth that was far from ordinary. Theseus was the son of Hera, a woman of royal blood, and Poseidon, the god of the seas, or in some versions, Hera's husband, King Aegeus of Athens. The circumstances of his conception are surrounded by myth, with both divine and mortal influences shaping the man who would go on to become one of the greatest heroes in Greek mythology. His father, Aegeus, had left behind a token of his identity, a heavy stone under which he placed his sandals and sword. Hera, upon learning of her pregnancy, was instructed to raise her son in secrecy until he was strong enough to lift the stone and retrieve these symbols of his royal heritage. Thus, Theseus' early life was one of quiet anticipation and hidden potential. It was destined that one day he would come to know his true nature and fulfill the divine promise that was tied to his blood. As a young man, Theseus felt an undeniable pull toward his father's kingdom in Athens, and upon reaching the appropriate age, he ventured forth, seeking to lift the stone that had been left as a sign of his heritage. With incredible strength, he lifted the stone, and in doing so, he proved his worthiness. From beneath it, he retrieved his father's tokens, the sandals and sword, and set out for Athens, unaware of the challenges that awaited him. His journey was filled with both adventure and peril, as Theseus encountered various threats along the way. Among the most notorious was Periphetes, a bandit known for his iron club. Theseus, ever the resourceful hero, fought and killed Periphetes, taking the bandit's club as a trophy. This victory marked the beginning of his transformation from a young man seeking his heritage to a full-fledged hero, capable of standing up against the forces that threatened the land. As Theseus continued his journey, he encountered more bandits and monsters, each one more dangerous than the last. He defeated Cenes, the pine bender, a giant who would trap travelers by bending pine trees and launching them into the air. Theseus managed to defeat Cenes using the same trick, turning the tables on the giant and sending him to his death. He also faced Sciron, a cruel robber who would force travelers to wash his feet and then kick them into the sea to be devoured by a giant turtle. Theseus, with his characteristic courage and cunning, killed Sciron and made sure no one else would suffer the same fate. Each of these encounters served to demonstrate not only Theseus' physical strength, but also his growing wisdom and sense of justice. He was not merely a warrior seeking glory. He was a man determined to rid the world of its darkness, one villain at a time. Upon his arrival in Athens, Theseus was recognized as the son of Aegeus, though his path was far from smooth. Aegeus, who had not yet fully accepted that his son was truly the hero he claimed to be, was hesitant at first. However, Theseus quickly proved his worth in Athens, not just through his strength but through his bravery and intelligence. His moment of greatest recognition came when the city of Athens was under the shadow of a terrible curse. Every year, as a tribute to the defeated Minotaur and the gods of Crete, Athens had to send 7 young men and 7 young women to be sacrificed in the labyrinth of King Minos. The labyrinth, designed by Daedalus, was a complex maze from which none had returned alive. The Minotaur, a monstrous creature that was half man and half bull, dwelled within it, feeding on the sacrifices. This cruel custom was a result of a tragic pact between the gods and Minos, a pact that had been made after Minos' son, Androgeos, was killed by the Athenians. Theseus, heartbroken by the suffering of his people, volunteered to be one of the 7 men sent to Crete. His bravery was unmatched, and he knew that if the Athenians were ever to be free of this annual sacrifice, he would need to confront the beast within the labyrinth. Upon arriving in Crete, Theseus met Princess Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, who immediately fell in love with him. Ariadne, aware of her father's cruelty and desperate to help Theseus, gave him a thread, a piece of yarn, which he could use to trace his way back to the labyrinth after confronting the Minotaur. With the help of Ariadne's gift, Theseus was able to navigate the labyrinth, find the Minotaur, and defeat the creature in single combat. This victory was not only a personal triumph, but a victory for Athens as a whole, as the sacrifice of the youth came to an end. Yet, the story of Theseus and the Minotaur did not end with victory alone. After slaying the beast, Theseus had promised to return to Athens with the black sails of his ship replaced by white ones, a signal that he had succeeded. But, in his celebration and in the heat of his triumph, Theseus forgot to change the sails, and when his father, Aegeus, saw the black sails from a distance, he believed his son had perished. Overcome with grief, Aegeus threw himself into the sea, ending his life in despair. The death of Aegeus was a tragic turn in Theseus' journey, a reminder that even the greatest of heroes are not immune to the whims of fate. Theseus, filled with sorrow and guilt, took his place as the king of Athens, though the loss of his father would haunt him throughout his reign. As king, Theseus faced many challenges, both from external enemies and internal struggles. He continued his work of unifying the various tribes of Attica, bringing together the scattered communities under a single banner. He established the Synechismos, a political union that helped to create the city-state of Athens as a dominant force in the Greek world. Theseus also fought against many other monsters and tyrants. Among the most significant of these was the cruel King Circean, whom he defeated in a wrestling match, and the robber Procrustes, who would stretch or shorten his victims to fit his iron bed. Theseus, ever the avenger of injustice, eliminated these threats to his people, further cementing his reputation as a king who ruled with strength and wisdom. Yet, Theseus' life was not without tragedy, and his reign was often marred by loss and conflict. One of the darkest chapters in his life came when he invited the children of the Amazonian warriors to Athens. In a tragic turn, the women of the Amazons attacked the city, leading to the Amazonomachy, a fierce and bloody war. Theseus, driven by both love and duty, had married the Amazonian queen Hippolyta, but the conflict that followed showed that even love could not prevent the ravages of war. In the end, Theseus' victories came at a great cost, for his relationships with the people around him were often tested by the consequences of his actions. The final years of Theseus' life were marked by even more personal trials. After a long reign, he was betrayed and exiled by his own people, driven out of Athens by political enemies who sought to undermine his authority. The tale of Jason and the Argonauts is one of the most captivating and heroic legends in Greek mythology, filled with adventure, danger, and the pursuit of an impossible goal. Jason's story begins with a promise made by his father, Aeson, king of Iolcus, who was dethroned by his half-brother, Peleus. Before his death, Aeson had left a legacy of hope for his son Jason. The prophecy that one day, Jason would return to reclaim the throne of Iolcus. The conditions of this prophecy were simple yet daunting. Jason would have to obtain the Golden Fleece, a symbol of authority and kingship, from the far-off land of Colchis, a distant and mysterious realm that lay beyond the known world. From the moment Jason learned of his father's fate and the prophecy that had been foretold, his life was set on a course that would define him as one of the greatest heroes of Greek myth. To retrieve the Golden Fleece, Jason would need not only courage and strength, but also the favor of the gods. His quest would require him to lead a band of extraordinary heroes, each of whom would have their own part to play in the dangerous journey ahead. But the greatest challenge for Jason was not the physical dangers he would face, but the moral and ethical dilemmas that would shape his leadership and test his character at every turn. With a sense of destiny weighing heavily upon him, Jason gathered a crew of the finest and bravest warriors in Greece, men and women who would come to be known as the Argonauts, named after the ship Argo, which they sailed on their perilous journey. The crew was a remarkable assembly of heroes, each with their own unique qualities and skills, and they included figures such as Orpheus, the legendary musician, Atalanta, the swift-footed huntress, and Hercules, the greatest of all Greek heroes. Together they set sail, embarking on a journey that would take them to distant lands, through stormy seas, and into the heart of dangers both mortal and divine. Their journey to Colchis was filled with extraordinary challenges, and the gods themselves, as always in Greek myths, played an active role in guiding and hindering the heroes along the way. The first major obstacle they faced was the clashing rocks, known as the Symplegades, which were a pair of enormous rocks that constantly moved toward each other, crushing anything that sailed between them. The Argonauts, under the guidance of the goddess Athena, managed to navigate these treacherous waters by sending a dove ahead to test the passage. By watching the dove's fate, they were able to steer the ship safely through the narrowing gap, losing only the tip of the ship's stern. This narrow escape marked the beginning of a long series of trials, each more dangerous than the last, and each bringing them closer to the Golden Fleece, but further from the safety of home. One of the most memorable challenges that Jason and his crew faced was their arrival on the island of Lemnos, where they were greeted by a tribe of women who had been abandoned by their husbands. These women, led by the queen Hypsipyle, had been cursed by Aphrodite to remain without male companionship, and they had taken to living in isolation. When Jason and his men arrived, they were met with warmth and hospitality, and Jason, being the leader he was, took advantage of the opportunity for rest and camaraderie. However, their stay was short-lived, as they soon had to continue their quest, leaving behind the women who had briefly offered them a sense of comfort amidst the trials of their journey. As the Argonauts sailed onward, their journey became increasingly perilous. They encountered the infamous Harpies, vile creatures that tormented the blind prophet Phineus, stealing his food and causing him constant suffering. Jason and the Argonauts, aided by the winged brothers Zeus and Calais, managed to chase the Harpies away, freeing Phineus from his torment. In gratitude, Phineus revealed to Jason and his crew the next stage of their journey, offering crucial advice that would help them navigate the dangers ahead. The journey continued, and eventually, the Argonauts reached the shores of Colchis, where the Golden Fleece was kept in the temple of Ares, guarded by a fierce dragon. The king of Colchis, Eets, was not a man who would easily part with such a powerful and sacred object. In fact, he demanded that Jason complete a series of nearly impossible tasks before he would allow him to claim the fleece. These included plowing a field with fire-breathing bulls, sowing dragon's teeth to grow an army of warriors, and defeating the warriors that sprang from the earth. It seemed that Eats had no intention of letting Jason succeed. However, Jason was not alone in his quest. The goddess Hera, who had watched over him from the beginning, took pity on him and sent the enchantress Medea, the daughter of Eats, to aid him. Medea, deeply in love with Jason after he had promised to marry her, gave him the knowledge and the magic needed to complete the impossible tasks. With her help, Jason was able to tame the fire-breathing bulls, defeat the army of warriors, and, with a final act of courage and cunning, retrieve the golden fleece from its guardian dragon. The myth of Oedipus is one of the most complex and tragic stories in Greek mythology, a tale that explores the themes of fate, identity, and the inescapable consequences of one's actions. Born to King Laius and Queen Jocasta of Thebes, Oedipus' life was doomed from the very moment of his birth, as a prophecy foretold that he would one day kill his father and marry his mother. In an attempt to avoid this horrific fate, Laius and Jocasta took drastic measures. They ordered that their infant son be left to die on a mountainside, his feet bound tightly to prevent him from escaping. This action, meant to defy the gods' will, only set in motion the tragic events that would unfold in Oedipus' life. However, fate is a force that cannot be easily thwarted. Oedipus was rescued by a shepherd, who took him to the city of Corinth, where he was adopted by King Polybus and Queen Merope, who had no children of their own. Raised as their son, Oedipus grew up unaware of his true parentage, his life shaped by love and care, but also by an underlying sense of confusion. As he matured, Oedipus began to hear rumors and whispers about his origins. The tension between the love he had for his adoptive parents and the uncertainty surrounding his true identity began to plague him. Determined to understand who he was and to avoid the terrible prophecy that had haunted his birth, Oedipus sought guidance from the Oracle of Delphi. The Oracle, speaking in cryptic terms, confirmed the prophecy that had been foretold long ago. Oedipus would indeed kill his father and marry his mother. Desperate to escape this fate, Oedipus left Corinth, believing that by distancing himself from his adoptive parents, he could outrun the prophecy. In his mind, the solution was clear. If he was not in Corinth, he could not kill Polybus, and if he never returned to his homeland, he would never marry his mother, Jocasta. Oedipus' journey took him to Thebes, where fate awaited him in a way he could never have anticipated. Thebes was suffering from a terrible plague, and the city was in desperate need of a hero. The oracle had decreed that the plague would only end when the murder of the previous king, Laius, was brought to justice. Unbeknownst to Oedipus, Laius was his real father, and the killer he sought to punish was himself. Upon arriving in Thebes, Oedipus, eager to help, vowed to find Laius' murderer and rid the city of the plague. In this noble quest, Oedipus sought the guidance of the blind prophet Tiresias, who, however, knew the truth about Oedipus' identity but was reluctant to reveal it. Tiresias, pressured by Oedipus, eventually revealed the devastating truth. Oedipus was the murderer he sought, and he had, in fact, killed his own father, Laius, and married his mother, Jocasta. This revelation shattered Oedipus' world. The reality of the prophecy, which he had so desperately tried to escape, now came crashing down upon him. In his search for truth and justice, Oedipus had unwittingly fulfilled the very fate that had been foretold at his birth. His quest for knowledge and freedom had led him directly into the grasp of the prophecy. At this moment, Jocasta, upon hearing the truth, took her own life, unable to bear the horror of what had happened. Oedipus, devastated by the consequences of his actions and the realization of his own identity, fell into despair. In a final act of self-punishment, Oedipus blinded himself with the brooches from Jocasta's gown. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional agony he felt. By blinding himself, Oedipus not only physically manifested the blindness he had been metaphorically suffering throughout his life, but he also accepted his fate, a fate that was unavoidable and inescapable, no matter how hard he tried to fight it. After blinding himself, Oedipus exiled himself from Thebes, as the city could not bear the presence of the man who had caused its suffering. He wandered the wilderness, a broken man, living in self-imposed exile and isolation. His tragic journey was not just one of physical exile, but of psychological torment, as he struggled to come to terms with the irreversible consequences of his actions. Yet, Even in his suffering, Oedipus was not abandoned by the gods. His story, though tragic, was part of a larger pattern in Greek mythology: the relentless, unyielding power of fate and the gods' influence over mortal lives. In the end, Oedipus' life was a reminder of the fragility of human existence and the inescapability of destiny. He was a man who sought to defy the gods, to rewrite the prophecy, but in doing so, he unknowingly fulfilled it. His tragic downfall illustrates the Greek belief that no matter how hard mortals strive to change their fate, they are ultimately powerless in the face of the gods' will. The gods, though they may be distant and aloof, were seen as the ultimate arbiters of justice, and they could not be avoided, no matter the strength or wisdom of the individual. The story of Oedipus also explores the theme of self-awareness and the search for truth. Oedipus' relentless pursuit of the truth, his desire to uncover the identity of Laius' murderer, ultimately led him to uncover the most painful truth of all: his own involvement in the tragedy. In his pursuit of justice, Oedipus unknowingly condemned himself, a man who had been both the cause and the victim of the very suffering he sought to end. This paradox, that the very pursuit of truth can lead to destruction, is a powerful theme in Greek tragedy, one that underscores the limits of human understanding and complexity of fate. The tragedy of Oedipus has inspired countless works of literature, art, and philosophy, and its themes resonate deeply in the exploration of human nature. It serves as a profound meditation on the limitations of human agency, the role of fate in shaping lives, and the consequences of pride and ignorance. Oedipus, despite his intelligence, strength, and determination, was ultimately powerless in the face of forces beyond his control. His tragedy, though a personal one, serves as a universal story about the human condition and the challenges of living in a world governed by forces larger than ourselves. The story of Perseus is one of the most iconic and enduring tales in Greek mythology, filled with divine intervention, heroism, and the timeless struggle between fate and free will. Born to Danae, the daughter of King Acrisius of Argos, Perseus' birth was a result of a prophecy that foretold his coming. The oracle had warned that Danae's son would one day kill her father, a prophecy that struck fear into the heart of Acrisius, who loved his daughter but feared the future. Determined to avoid this fate, Acrisius locked Danae away in a bronze chamber, far from the reach of any man. However, the will of the gods could not be thwarted by mortal means. Zeus, the king of the gods, came to Danae in the form of golden rain, and from their union, Perseus was born. When Acrisius learned of his daughter's son, he was filled with dread and uncertainty. Despite his efforts to prevent the prophecy from coming true, he saw no way of avoiding it. In a final act of desperation, he placed Danae and her infant son in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, hoping they would perish. But again, fate had other plans. The chest was carried by the waves to the island of Seriphos, where it was found by a kind fisherman named Dictys. Dictys took in Danae and Perseus, raising the boy as his own, unaware of the prophecy that hung over them. As Perseus grew, he became a handsome and strong young man, unaware of his divine heritage. His father, King Polydectes of Seriphos, soon became infatuated with Danae, but Danae, who had come to love Dictys, rejected his advances. Polydectes, angered by her refusal, devised a cruel plan to rid himself of Perseus. He tricked Perseus into promising to bring him the head of the Gorgon Medusa, a task that seemed impossible, even for a hero, but which Polydectes believed would be the boy's doom. Medusa, one of the three Gorgons, was a terrifying creature whose gaze could turn any living being to stone. She lived in the farthest reaches of the world, beyond the land of the living, and the idea of retrieving her head was a task that no one had ever succeeded in. But Perseus, driven by a sense of duty to his mother and an innate bravery, accepted the challenge. He set off on a journey that would take him to distant lands and force him to confront unimaginable dangers. Along the way, Perseus received aid from the gods. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, gave him a polished shield that would allow him to view Medusa's reflection rather than looking directly at her and being turned to stone. Hermes, the messenger god, gave him winged sandals to help him fly to the far-off lands where the Gorgons lived. Finally, the nymphs of the north provided him with a magical sack to hold Medusa's head and a helmet of invisibility, which would allow him to move unseen by his enemies. With the help of the gods and his own courage, Perseus made his way to the lair of the Gorgons. There, he found Medusa and her two sisters, who were hideous and monstrous. Medusa, once a beautiful woman, had been cursed by Athena for desecrating her temple. Her hair was turned into writhing snakes, and her gaze was deadly. Perseus, using his shield to avoid looking directly at Medusa, approached her carefully. In one swift motion, he decapitated her, capturing her head in the magical sack that the nymphs had given him. But as he did so, the blood of Medusa spilled onto the ground, and from it sprang the winged horse Pegasus and the giant Chrysaor, both of whom would play important roles in the world of heroes. With Medusa's head in hand, Perseus set off on his return journey. Along the way, he encountered more challenges, but none so formidable as the one he would face next. While traveling through Ethiopia, Perseus came upon the princess Andromeda, who was chained to a rock, awaiting her fate. Andromeda's mother, Queen Cassiopeia, had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs, angering Poseidon. In his wrath, Poseidon sent a sea monster to ravage the land, and Andromeda was to be sacrificed to it. Perseus, moved by her beauty and her plight, offered to save her in exchange for her hand in marriage. With his winged sandals, he flew to the sea monster and, using the head of Medusa, turned the beast to stone. Perseus freed Andromeda, and they were married soon after, though the couple would face their own trials in the years to come. As Perseus made his way home, he encountered yet another twist of fate. The prophecy that had been foretold at his birth was now within reach. In the distance, Perseus saw a familiar figure, his grandfather, King Acrisius, who had ruled over Argos and sought to escape his fate by exiling his daughter and her son. When Acrisius learned that Perseus had returned victorious and was now a hero, he was both overjoyed and filled with a sense of dread, for he feared that the prophecy would come true, that he would die at the hands of his grandson. Determined to avoid his fate, Acrisius tried to leave Argos, but fate, as always, cannot be outrun. In a cruel twist of fate, the prophecy was fulfilled not in the way Acrisius had expected.